The Castellammarese War, 1929 to 1931. In the late 1920s, New York's Italian-American underworld was split between two titans, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, both vying for control of America's lucrative bootlegging trade. Each commanded dozens of crews, hundreds of gunmen, and deep connections to politicians and police. What began as business disagreements turned into a full-scale mafia civil war, claiming more than 60 lives in just 2 years. Enter a younger, more pragmatic generation, Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, men who saw endless revenge as bad business. Luciano secretly met with Maranzano, orchestrated Masseria's death in 1931, and soon after turned on Maranzano himself. Both old bosses were gunned down that same year, ending the bloodshed. From the ashes, Luciano created the Commission, a governing council to divide power among the 5 families and prevent future wars. For the first time, organized crime operated like a corporation, structured, wealthy, and nationwide. The Castellammarese War wasn't just a gang feud, it was the moment the American Mafia unified, traded chaos for order, and wrote the business plan for organized crime in the 20th century. The Chicago Outfit versus Moran Gang. Beer Wars, 1920s. During Prohibition, Chicago erupted into open warfare over one commodity, beer. On one side stood Al Capone, the calculating boss of the South Side Outfit, raking in what would equal hundreds of millions today through bootlegging. Across the river, George Bugs Moran led the North Side Gang, vowing never to bow to Capone's rule. From 1924 to 1929, their feud turned the city into a battleground, bombings, drive-bys, and nearly 500 killings tied to liquor. Everything changed on February 14, 1929, when Capone's men, dressed as police, executed 7 of Moran's men in a North Clark Street garage, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Moran escaped by minutes, but his gang never recovered. Federal outrage brought fresh scrutiny to Capone, leading to tax evasion charges that finally jailed him. The beer wars cemented Capone as a dark legend and forced the federal government to expand crime-fighting powers, birthing the FBI's modern mission. Chicago wasn't just drenched in alcohol. It was soaked in ambition, fear, and the price of criminal empire building. The Purple Gang Wars, Detroit, 1920s to 1930s. While New York and Chicago dominated headlines, Detroit's Purple Gang became one of America's most feared mobs. Made up largely of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, they controlled illegal whiskey moving across the Detroit-Windsor border, a pipeline worth millions. Initially united under Abe, Joe, and Ray Bernstein, the group thrived, but greed splintered loyalty. By the late 1920s, factions formed, and disputes over shipments and kickbacks erupted into assassinations. The Purples fought outsiders like the Licavoli mob, but the worst bloodshed came from within. The so-called Collingwood Manor Massacre in 1931 marked the gang's brutal implosion. Law enforcement crackdown, betrayal, and internal killings dismantled what had been Detroit's most powerful criminal syndicate. Yet their legend lives on. The Purple Gang's rise and fall showed how quickly street-born unity collapses under the weight of power and profit. For historians, it sits as the cautionary tale of the Prohibition underworld. Chaos wears a nice suit until the money runs out. The Harlem Gang Wars, 1930s to 1940s. As Prohibition waned, Harlem became the beating heart of New York's underground economy. Competing mobsters Dutch Schultz, a white gangster backed by the Mafia, and Stephanie St. Clair, a fearless black numbers queen, fought bitterly for control of Harlem's gambling and policy rackets. When Schultz tried muscling in, Harlem's community united behind Queenie and her powerful ally Bumpy Johnson. Assassinations, beatings, and police payoffs defined the decade. When Schultz was murdered in 1935, authorized, it said, by Lucky Luciano, the Mafia moved in more quietly, but Johnson held the line for Harlem's independence. Later figures like Frank Lucas would rise from this foundation, exporting Harlem's underworld influence into the global heroin trade. The Harlem Gang Wars weren't just about territory. They symbolized a struggle for racial autonomy, dignity, and business power inside a criminal world that mirrored America's own segregated economy. The French Connection Wars, 1950s to 1970s. After World War II, heroin surged back into American streets, and its main artery ran from Marseille, France, to New York City. Corsican syndicates, Sicilian mafiosi, and American dealers formed a network that fed tens of tons of narcotics into U.S. cities. With profits exploding, rival gangs and brokers fought. Luciano's old associates, French chemists in the milieu, and New York crime families all vying for control. Law enforcement battles mirrored the underworld's chaos. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics pursued legendary cases. In 1962, they seized more than 100 pounds of heroin, a record haul that barely dented the flow. The war escalated after the 1971 film The French Connection dramatized real events. A year later, agents cracked the actual pipeline, destroying Marseille's heroin labs and breaking the U.S.-European axis. That takedown shifted narcotics power to Latin America, shaping all modern drug wars that followed. The French Connection proved how international crime alliances and the violent rivalries within them could redraw America's criminal map forever. Crips vs. Bloods, Los Angeles, 1970s to present. Born in south-central Los Angeles amid poverty and racial tension, the blue-wearing Crips, founded by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams, rose in the early 1970s as a loose neighborhood coalition promising protection. But as they expanded, smaller groups banded together in red, the Bloods, to resist. What began as local turf rivalry spiraled into decades of street war. By the 1980s crack epidemic, conflict exploded into thousands of shootings. The Los Angeles Police Department counted more than 700 gang-related homicides a year, many rooted in Crip blood feuds. Hip-hop carried their imagery worldwide, while community activists fought to redirect attention to unemployment and policing injustice. Though truces occasionally formed, from the 1992 Watts Truce to modern peace marches, the rivalry still claims lives. The Crips and Bloods became shorthand for America's inner-city pain, a war born from neglect, fueled by drugs, and immortalized by culture. Latin Kings versus Gangster Disciples, Chicago and Midwest, 1980s to 1990s. In Chicago's dense housing projects, two ideologies fought for dominance. The Latin Kings, rooted in Puerto Rican and Latino pride under the motto Amor de Rey, love of the king, and the Gangster Disciples, a black gang unified under Larry Hoover's philosophy of growth and development. What started as territorial clashes soon evolved into an all-out war across the city's south and west sides. Drive-bys, prison-ordered hits, and school-zone battles left hundreds dead each year through the late 80s and early 90s. Federal crackdowns like Operation Frozen Assets in 1995 targeted gang finances, while Hoover's conviction marked the movement's decline. Still, both organizations remain active, more structured than most street gangs, complete with oaths, symbols, and hierarchies. Their feud shaped how law enforcement viewed organized street crime, forcing the FBI and local police to treat gangs less like loose crews and more like small armies. The Kings and Disciples left a legacy etched in Chicago's skyline, murals of loyalty, fear, and survival. The Westies versus the Mafia, Hell's Kitchen, 1970s, 1980s. On Manhattan's gritty West Side, an Irish-American gang known as the Westies controlled Hell's Kitchen with terrifying efficiency. Led by Jimmy Coonan and enforcer Mickey Featherstone, they blended neighborhood loyalty with cold brutality. Body dismemberment and intimidation were trademarks. Seeking stability, Coonan allied with the Gambino crime family, promising muscle in exchange for protection and profit. For a while, it worked. The Westies became the Mafia's unofficial Irish arm in Manhattan, collecting debts and running rackets under Gambino oversight. But greed and paranoia eroded the alliance. When murders drew police attention, Mafia partners distanced themselves, leaving the Westies exposed. FBI infiltration, wiretaps, and Featherstone's eventual cooperation in court destroyed the gang by the late 1980s. Their rise and fall showed that even in the Mafia ecosystem, outsiders could thrive, briefly, if they were ruthless enough. The Westies turned New York's smallest neighborhood into one of its loudest legends. Hells Angels versus Mongols motorcycle clubs, 1960s to present. Across American highways, leather jackets replaced suits and shotguns replaced silencers in a rivalry spanning 6 decades. The Hells Angels and the Mongols. Both began as brotherhoods for freedom-loving bikers in California. The Angels in the 1940s, the Mongols in the late 1960s.
But pride, patches, and territory soon clashed. Within years, gunfights erupted outside bars, rallies, and biker gatherings nationwide. Major flashpoints, like the Laughlin River Run riot in 2002 that left 3 dead, turned their feud into the stuff of outlaw folklore. The stakes weren't just symbols. Control over drug routes, weapons sales, and club territory meant real power. Federal agents launched massive investigations, naming both clubs organized crime enterprises. Despite raids and hundreds of arrests, neither side surrendered. Their conflict evolved into a long, low-burn war of pride, one that stretched from highways to prison yards, keeping the mythology of the American outlaw alive and roaring beneath the sound of motorcycles.
The crack-era drug turf wars, 1980s. When crack cocaine hit American cities in the early 1980s, it shattered neighborhoods and rewrote the economics of street crime. A single rock sold for as little as $5, but the profit margins were staggering. In places like South Bronx, Compton, and Miami's Liberty City, young crews turned corners into battle posts, fighting for every block. Violence skyrocketed. Some cities saw homicide rates double within 5 years. Kids barely 16 carried pistols. Semi-automatics appeared where switchblades once ruled. The turf wars weren't just gang versus gang. They pitted entire projects against each other, with families trapped in between. Federal response came as the war on drugs. Harsh mandatory minimum laws flooded prisons while failing to end demand. The crack era faded by the mid-1990s, but its scars, mass incarceration, broken trust, militarized policing, remain part of America's social landscape. Those chaotic years turned city streets into unending battlefields and left a permanent echo in urban policy, music, and memory.
The Miami Cocaine Wars, 1970s to 1980s. Before Miami Vice, there was the real thing, a city under siege. Colombian cartels like Medellin and Cali, aided by Cuban exile smugglers such as Griselda Blanco and Carlos Later, poured tons of cocaine through Florida's coast. Overnight, Miami became the cocaine capital of the world, with smugglers buying mansions faster than police could keep up. By 1981, the murder rate hit 621 killings in a single year, many daytime assassinations in streets and malls. Law enforcement fought back with the DEA's Operation Swordfish and the creation of federal drug corridors. But money and firepower made kingpins untouchable, at least for a while. The cocaine wars transformed Miami's skyline with narco cash, reshaped law enforcement tactics, and birthed the era of high-gloss crime TV. When the smoke cleared, hundreds were dead, entire empires dismantled, and America had learned that glamour and blood often share the same beach. Mexican Mafia La M versus Nuestra Familia, California Prison Wars, 1960s to 1990s. Inside California's prison system, 2 rival organizations came to dominate Latino inmates: the Mexican Mafia La M in Southern California and the Nuestra Familia in the north. La M began at Dual Vocational Institution in 1957, uniting hardened Southern gang members under military discipline. Northern inmates, tired of Southern abuse, formed the Nuestra Familia in 1968 at Soledad Prison as a counterforce. What followed was a war so vicious it shaped decades of prison strategy. Every yard became divided: Sureños for the south, Norteños for the north. Murders, coded orders, and vendettas spilled outside, controlling neighborhoods from Los Angeles to San Jose. In 1981 alone, California logged dozens of prison killings linked to the feud. By the 1990s, federal RICO cases began dismantling leadership, but both armies still influence gangs on the streets. The MA Familia conflict remains one of America's longest-running criminal civil wars, a fight born behind bars, carried on in every alley marked red or blue. Yakuza Triad Alliances versus U.S. Asian gangs, West Coast, 1980s to 1990s. In the wake of immigration waves from Southeast Asia, Los Angeles and San Francisco saw the rise of new power players: Watching, Asian Boys, and Tiny Rascals Gang, many linked, loosely or directly, to international groups like Japan's Yakuza or China's Triads. What started as self-protection networks of young refugees evolved into highly organized crews running extortion, gambling, and heroin. Territory wars broke out across Chinatown districts and suburban malls. Drive-bys in Monterey Park and Westminster, assassinations on Sunset Boulevard. These weren't random acts, but signals in a trans-Pacific power contest. By the 1990s, FBI operations like Red Dragon uncovered deep links to overseas syndicates. These conflicts were smaller than the historic Mafia wars, but symbolized the globalization of U.S. organized crime. They showed that as America changed demographically, so did its underworld, diverse, connected, and ready to fight for a piece of every black market empire. MS-13 versus Barrio 18, Los Angeles and Central America, 1990s to present. Out of the refugee neighborhoods of Los Angeles in the 1980s came two groups that would grow far beyond their blocks. Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, founded by Salvadoran Youths for Protection, and Barrio 18, 18th Street Gang, one of the city's oldest Latino gangs. When mass deportations in the 90s sent thousands of members back to Central America, they exported Los Angeles gang culture to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. There, poverty, civil war scars, and weak governments turned a street rivalry into a transnational war. Cities like San Salvador recorded murder rates exceeding 100 per 100,000, among the world's highest. In the U.S., the feud continued inside prisons and immigrant communities, inspiring massive crackdowns by ICE and the FBI's MS-13 task force. The conflict's real tragedy lies in its circularity. Each arrest or deportation often plants the seeds of violence elsewhere. From urban Los Angeles to rural Central America, the MS-13 and Barrio 18 war remains one of the most far-reaching and enduring in modern gang history. Chicago gang wars of the 2010s, Black Disciples, Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and others. By the 2010s, Chicago's South and West Sides faced a new kind of gang warfare, fragmented, digital, and relentless. After old guard leaders were imprisoned, once unified organizations splintered into hundreds of small sets. The feud between Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples reignited, joined by rivals like the Vice Lords, each claiming only a few blocks, but defending them with social media bravado and real guns. At its worst, 2016 saw over 760 homicides, the city's highest in 2 decades. Instagram Live, drill music, and viral taunts replaced traditional hierarchies, turning online words into offline killings. Police data confirmed most shootings traced back to personal feuds amplified by the internet. Chicago's modern gang war isn't about bootlegging or organized profit. It's about identity, survival, and revenge played out for a global audience. It's the successor to a century of American underworld violence, reborn in pixels, posts, and city blocks soaked with history and heartbreak.